decided that tonight's webinar is all about the environmental impacts of food. So our presenter is Dr. Mike Joy, and I'll tell you a little bit more about him shortly. So this is one of a number of webinars that we've held this year as part of our plant-based webinar series. Our first one that we had was with Dr. Luke Wilson, who's from Wellington, and that's about next level health. Then we had Emma Strutt, who's a dietitian, talking about optimizing a plant-based diet. And last month, as mentioned, we had MasterChef winner Aaron Brunet talking about how to cook like a MasterChef. So all of those webinars are freely available to view on the Better Base website if you'd like to go back and have a look. And then tonight we've got Mike talking about the future of food. And next month we have endurance athlete and coach Ben Eichelberg talking about plant-based fitness. So part of what we do at the Better Base is hold these webinars, and I think they're a really cool way to connect with people all over the country. We also do events. So yesterday morning we had a breakfast event at the Botanist, and Mike presented the same presentation, and we had a really great culinary experience at the same time. So hopefully you brought your own plant-based snacks to watch this one, but luckily you can do it in the comfort of your own home. So you didn't have to battle the wind and the rain that we did in Wellington yesterday morning. So we've hosted events for hundreds of people around the country, and we're just really excited to be sharing this message with a lot more people who are interested in being healthier and also reducing their environmental footprint. So this is our website. You can have a look at afterwards. And tonight we have got, as mentioned, Dr. Mike Joy, who's going to be talking to us about the future of food. So a little bit more about Mike. After seeing firsthand the decline in our freshwater health in New Zealand, he became an outspoken advocate for environmental protection. So Mike gained his Bachelor of Science and his Master's and PhD in ecology from Massey University, and he began lecturing there in ecology and environmental science in 2003, and since then has received numerous awards for his work. So these include the inaugural New Zealand University's Critic and Conscience Award, and he was a semi-finalist for the 2018 Kiwibank New Zealander of the Year. In 2015, Mike published a book called Polluted Inheritance, New Zealand's Freshwater Crisis, and Mike's now working at Victoria University. He's got a goal of strengthening connections between science, policy, and real outcomes to address multiple environmental issues facing New Zealand. So food is a really key part of these environmental challenges that we're facing. And tonight Mike's going to be summarizing why and how our food system needs to change to become more sustainable. So I'm going to ask Mike to turn on his camera now, and I will hand over, and following this presentation we're going to be having a Q&A discussion. So please feel free to drop your questions in the box below, and I'll be taking note of these as we go through. There's a lot of information here to absorb, but it is really inspiring and action focused. So I'm going to hand over to Mike now, and I will jump back on for the Q&A. Thank you so much, Mike, for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, Hannah. This is my very first webinar, so it's kind of a strange experience for me to be looking at my laptop in this little room, which I call my library, and not being able to get a feel for how the audience is reacting. So yeah, I'll give it a go and see how it goes. Okay, so I guess I can flick through these slides. I'm not sure how this will work. Yes. Okay. So I guess one of the really big issues for me is getting people to understand that there are some really huge issues for the planet. And I didn't come to plant-based food. I mean, there's multiple reasons why you can come to it, but for me, it was just the inevitable outcome of seeing the damage that our current food system has. And so what I'm going to talk about is how do we feed this huge population that we have and still maintain the life supporting capacity of the planet. There's a whole lot of changes coming that we have to be aware of. This kind of the problems are the declining amount of land available to grow food as the population grows, the decline in fossil fuels, and not many people are aware of this, that there's kind of this belief that fossil fuels will be there forever. But I want to talk about this thing called energy return on investment. That means that we've taken all of the cheap and easy fossil fuels and now we're getting into the hard stuff, and it's going to have big impacts for us. I'm going to talk about declining water quality, the impacts of agriculture on water quality, biodiversity and fisheries, and climate change, of course, which is, you know, around another symptom of all this sort of limits to growth that we have. Other impacts with animal agriculture, like antibiotic resistance and lots of other things. But the really key thing to think about, and it's a depressing figure, is that we have an extra 80 to 90 million mouths to feed every year, and increasing sort of proportions of animal products as countries become better off. They want more animals in their diet, fish and terrestrial animals. So we end up needing more and more fossil fuels to do that, and increasing food wastage as well, which is another really big problem. Okay, so when we look around at the planet, and you will have seen lots of these reports coming out. It's great to see that the mainstream media are now picking up these stories about biodiversity loss and the increase in world population, and the end of marine fisheries if we don't do something, and the declining graphs as well. So the steep sort of hockey stick graphs of all the things that we're doing wrong, and then the declines of things like biodiversity. And a lot of these things we're just seeing the beginning of them. We're nowhere near the worst. There's this, you get things like, the scientists would have to be the most conservative people you ever meet. All our training is about being super careful and cautious before we say anything, and so things tend to have to get really bad before scientists speak up. So this report here, which was a follow-up report from scientists from 184 countries, 15,000 scientists put their name to this first, the second reminder, but the one that sort of came out middle of last year. Since then, another 10,000 or more scientists have signed up to the last count. It was over 25,000 scientists have this dire warning to humanity that if we don't change what we're doing drastically, we will not have a future as a species. So we're losing the foundations of how we produce food. You know, you sort of end up in the situation where it looks like it's okay. The measurements look okay, but what we're missing out on is the fact that we're just borrowing against the future. And it takes a while for biological systems to kind of let you know that something's happened. Things look good, and then suddenly there's a decline. They're not linear declines, they're nearly always a crash that happens. So what you're starting to see already, though, is that as we have more and more people, and we have less and less land, of course, because the planet isn't getting any bigger, but at the same time, we're actually losing available land because we build houses on it, we salinate it through irrigation so that it becomes too salty to grow anything, and desertification, where we chop down all the forests and we change the microclimate and it turns into a desert. And so those things combined mean that that little piece of land per person is shrinking and shrinking, and what there is available is becoming degraded as well. We get water running out as well, so same problem. More and more people. Most of the major rivers in the world now no longer reach the sea. You know, all of the big ones, the Colorado River, the Yellow River, the Murray-Darling River, they just don't make it to the sea anymore because we take too much water out of them. And so that's another huge issue on the horizon. But the thing that that was a shock to me, I mean, I was looking, and I'll show you some examples of the impacts of nitrogen on our waterways. And when I sort of looked a bit deeper, I found out that the nitrogen that's causing the problems in our waterways and on our offshore environments as well, and lakes and groundwaters, actually comes from fossil fuels. So if you look at this graph and you look at world population growth, but the dashed line, sorry, the dashed dark line is the percentage of the world population that's fed by the Haber-Bosch process, which is the which is the Harbour well, these are a couple of German scientists who discovered at the early last century that you could use fossil fuels to cheat and take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and make it into a form that you could put straight onto the land as fertilizer and grow. And so now, and you can trace this in your body. So now something like 80% of the nitrogen molecules that you'll find in your body have come from fossil fuels. And so you can see how much that population growth is driven by artificial nitrogen. And this has really big issues for trying to feed the world, because that the thing that gets called the green revolution, which we kind of kid ourselves was this technological breakthrough, and we're so clever that we could feed so many more people, was actually just turning oil or fossil fuels or energy that was stored over millennia into instant energy and food so that we could grow this population. So there's a reckoning coming when we don't have these fossil fuels available, and we have to be able to feed the world without fossil fuels. And that's where animals come into the picture, because if most of it's going to feed animals, then you're not efficiently using what you've got there. And so that's what we have to be aware of. Then of course there's all these other things going on. It's not just it's not an equity issue here. We've got 1 billion people suffering from inadequate and insecure diets, maybe a sixth or a seventh of the world, and a couple of billion people who are obese or overweight. And there's been this whole move over the last last century, I guess, to highly processed foods, high in refined sugar, refined fats, oils, and meat, of course, increasing in the diet. And it's not just the fossil fuels either. We use so much energy in our production systems, so inefficient. So if you're talking about beef in your diet, something over 33 units of fossil energy is used to give you 1 unit, or 33 to 1, that the unit of food energy that's available at the end of that process. So it's incredibly wasteful of energy. So that ERO I talked about, the energy return on investment, is in the 30s, it was around 70. That means 1 barrel of oil to get 70 barrels back again. Now it's less than 15 globally, which means it takes 1 barrel of oil will only give you 15 barrels of oil now. And that means that it's because all of the easy stuff is gone, and now we're having to really squeeze it out of the rocks. We're having to frack it. We're having to go to deep sea, really, really highly energy demanding processes to get the oil that we use and the gas that we use to make the fertilizer as well. So that oil, we started eating oil, and that enabled this massive population boost growth that we have. Now we're coming to the end of oil. We have some really big issues. And just to give you an idea, and some of you will have heard these figures before and won't be shocked, but I'm sure there'll be still some people that haven't heard about this. But if you take all the mammals on the planet and you split them into two groups, the wild animals and then the animals that include us and the animals we eat and our pets, you split them into two groups, wild and us, and you get this amazing figure that 98% of the biomass or the weight of humans and our animals is, well, the mammals on the planet is humans and our livestock, and about 2% for mammals. And if you take for all terrestrial animals, it's about 97.3. So 2 or 3% are wild animals. And this is an example of, we have, it's not surprising that we have 1,000 to 10,000 increase in the rate of biodiversity loss on the planet. When you see this, you realize that there is such a tiny proportion of the animals left on the planet that are wild. So no wonder we have that biodiversity loss. Okay, so but the key to the issue really, and New Zealand is a great example of this, that only 17% of the nitrogen that's applied as fertilizer actually gets into the food. The rest of it just leaks out to do harm in the environment. So, for example, for every 100 kilograms of nitrate fertilizer that's applied, some goes up into the atmosphere as nitrous oxide, which is 3 times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, and it's also the most ozone depleting gas. And you can measure that in the atmosphere as well, in the same way that you can with carbon dioxide. was pre-industrial 270 parts per billion. Now it's up to 320 parts per billion. And what we see as a result of all that nitrogen leaking out is the waterways that are full of, we call it eutrophication. It's just simply that if you imagine that you put the nitrogen on the paddocks to grow grass and to grow food, if it ends up in water, it grows algae. And that's when you start to get these things. And you get the dead zones offshore. So it doesn't just end in the rivers, it goes out into the oceans. And now that there's 400 named dead zones around the planet where life can't survive because there isn't enough oxygen. And that area, to give you an idea of that area, that's roughly the land area of New Zealand. So the oceans have dead zones equivalent to that land area of New Zealand. To give you an idea of what it looks like in New Zealand, is you see this map here, and this is from Ministry for the Environment's webpage. You can look at, there's some great apps that you can look at these things. And so the orangey parts of that map are the ones that, and then there's the rivers that don't meet the current guideline levels, that ANZG is the ANZAC, Australia and New Zealand guideline. And they've just, it's the model numbers here because there's just individual sites and they've just filled in those gaps. So if you know New Zealand, you'll know where that they're the farmed parts of New Zealand and the intensively farmed parts of New Zealand and where our cities are. And if we just move on to see how that affects what happens in the rivers, then it's not just nitrogen, it's phosphorus as well from farming, and it's also sediment from land clearance and intensive farming. And this measure here, this macroinvertebrate community index, is the best measure we have, the most long trusted scientific measure of the health of waterways, and it's obtained by looking at the life in the river, and it gives you there's these narratives that go with it. So all of those orange and red areas on the map are either moderately or severely polluted. And again, I'm sure you'll be able to see that that's where the Southland, Canterbury, Hawke's Bay, Manawatu, Taranaki, Waikato, and a bit of Northland are the intensively farmed and intensively humanised parts of the country. And I mean, it really gives a lie to that idea that New Zealand's clean and green. Our lowland, intensively farmed waterways are in really bad shape. This map of Canterbury it's actually a little video clip, and the date's down the bottom, and that's 1969. And there's some little orange blotches that you might be able to make out there, and that was dairy farms in 1969. And then the movie clicks through, and you see that huge proportion of lowland Canterbury is now in dairy farms, and what it was this big conversion from sheep and a little bit of cropping into intensively farmed dairy. It happened over, really didn't start to happen until the early 1990s, and so the last 25 years is when really big land use changes happened there. And they needed lots of water because it was too dry to dairy farm. That's why it wasn't dairy farmed in the past. And so the process involved clearance of thousands and thousands and millions probably of trees, of shelter belts that were put up, when the first settlers came there to protect that land from the big northwest winds that come down and dry out the soils. And so the trees were chopped down so they could put these pivot irrigators in. And I'm sure lots of you have seen the big crop circles that you see, the massive pivot irrigators that irrigate that land now to have dairy in there. And it's the shelter belts, the highest evapotranspiration rates in New Zealand happen across those plains, and now they're so much worse now that those shelter belts have gone. And in a strong nor'wester now, the evapotranspiration rate is, because the trees are gone and it's such a drying wind, the irrigator going as fast as it can go can't put water onto that land as fast as the wind takes it away again. So it's just really, really stupid land use. So that's what it looks like. So that's 2019. We've got the extra slide there now, so you can see from there in 1969 to that now. That's the dairy farming part of New Zealand. And what it's meant is a huge amount of nitrogen, and that it's very gravelly, dry, bony soil. The water moves through it really, really quickly, and there are lots of aquifers under the land there that provide the drinking water to all the people of Canterbury. And so if you think about making milk in an area like that using irrigation, then you need a huge amount of water to do it. And when you look at grey water, and there's when you think about a water footprint, there's the water that goes onto the land, there's the water, the rainfall, there's the irrigation water, they're the blue and green waters, and the grey water is how much water do you need to dilute the nitrogen pollution back to a level that's healthy or doesn't harm the environment or people. And it turns out to meet a quite reasonable standard of 0.8 milligrams per litre, which is a safe level for drinking water. It takes 90,000 litres of water to produce a kilogram of milk solids. The industry numbers that they'll tell you is 10,000. So it's actually 9 times more water than what they say is needed to dilute that water. And so, or another way of looking at it is you need 25 times more rainfall to dilute that much, or you need 35 times less nitrogen going onto the land. So it's if you take in all of the Canterbury Plains, even the bits that aren't dairy, then it's still 17 times more nitrogen is put in through those farming systems with cows than the environment can handle. So what happened recently was a study came out of Denmark. 25 years and 9 million people were in this study, and it's not the only one, but it's the most recent and the most comprehensive one. And Denmark had a big problem with nitrate in intensive farming as well, but they got onto it 20 years ago and started turning it around, but they've still got some legacy issues. And so there's a big range of nitrate in drinking water, and what the study found of the 9 million people was that around 0.9 milligrams per litre of nitrate, you get a significant increase in the chance of getting colorectal cancer. So this is, bowel cancer and a whole range of them in that part of the body. And at 2.1 milligrams, then there is a 15% increase in the chance of getting colorectal cancer. So I was really shocked and worried by this because I know that the levels in the rivers are much higher than that. So Hannah mentioned that I got this Critic and Conscience Award, and it came with a $50,000 prize, which sounds really nice, but I didn't get to spend it on my mortgage. I had to use it for research. So I bought this really expensive sort of lab quality nitrate kit that I could take into the field with me. And I went down to Christchurch, and with a team of people, we collected water samples from around. And this is, I'll show you. So we had these water samples, and we looked at how many people were getting the drinking water at those levels. But I'll just show you. This is the map that I had before that showed the intensification of dairy. Again, this is one of these movie clips that I can't show you, but I can show you the end point. So there you can see the orange, which is the farms, the conversions to dairy, but all of those red bars are groundwater sites, that monitoring sites that the regional council have that exceed that 15% increase in the chance of getting colorectal cancer. So if you look, and if you get to see the movie, it just shows so clearly that as the farms spread across the country, all of the bores that had no nitrate in them or no measurable nitrates start to come up, and just in 30 years you end up with these massive, all of these bars like this. So, and this is these two maps here are from the Ministry for the Environment. And what they show, the left map there shows all of the yellow ones are greater than 3 milligrams, which is even higher than that 15% increase in the chance of getting it. And you can see right through Canterbury and down into Southland, the bores are exceeding that. And if you look on the right, you'll see that all of those red dots are ones that are either orange or red, are either likely or very likely worsening. So we're just starting to see the beginning of the impact on the groundwater from that dairy intensification. So when we went down with the meter, and I drove around for a couple of days with the help of some friends down there from Fish and Game, and we put the word out on Facebook and got people to bring samples into us. And the graph on the right is the 113 samples that we got from people. And what you can see there is there's the two red lines. One's the 15% increase, the higher one, and the other one's the significant risk increase. And you can see on the right with the rural areas, then the drinking water in those towns was, like more than half exceeded the 15% increase in the chance of getting it, and 80% exceeded the significant increase. And if you look at the graph on the left, then that's the city council's database. That's their sampling that they do of all of the drinking water in the city, and that was 2015. And you can see that a third of them exceed the 15%, and half of them exceed the significant increase in chance of getting colorectal cancer. So you can see this is a massive issue for the future of Canterbury and drinking water. And the really sad bit about this, well, I mean, the whole thing's sad, but the sad bit for me is that by highlighting this risk, people are going to buy bottled water. And why wouldn't they? I mean, if I was down there, I wouldn't want to drink this, knowing the chances of getting colorectal cancer are increasing. So I'm helping out corporations that get our water for free, our best water. So if you look at the city council map, they get the drinking water, the bottled water from the right at the very, very lowest nitrate end. And because we pretend in this country that nobody owns water, then they get to get it for free and sell it to us, and we drink the poor quality stuff. So it's a huge issue that we have to think about. But this is just a really good example of the failure of councils and government to regulate intensification, and down the track you see the impact on the rest of the society. So if we want to look at, just go back to global picture now in the European Union, and this is a really good example where the study, and it was a big study, showed that about 11 million tonnes of nitrogen are added in the European Union, which gives a benefit to farmers and growers of somewhere between 20 and $80 billion a year, and that's adding in long-term gains. But the cost to society of that, and this is based on the estimates of damage to human health, ecosystems, biodiversity, then it's something like $70 to $320 billion a year that it costs society. So that's really similar if you think about that, the Canterbury situation, where a bunch of farmers and industrial farming companies that sell them all of irrigation equipment and that kind of thing. It was a massive economic boom for Canterbury, but now the price comes, and it will be the similar sort of ratio to this, where it can be 3 or 4 times what you think you gain from it is how much it costs to clean up. And here in New Zealand, we've looked at a similar situation where we have a couple of lakes here, Lake Taupo and Lake Rotorua, where farmers are being paid not to farm. If we paid to protect the lakes, if we paid the same rate that those farmers have been paid or are being paid for all farmers and all dairy farmers in New Zealand, then you would have something like $24 billion is what you'd have to pay. Or in other words, that's the subsidy that we give to intensive farming in New Zealand, $24 billion, because nobody's cleaning up those rivers. We're just in aquifers and lakes. We're just letting the nitrate build up. So, this is such a false economy. Nitrogen's just one of the planetary boundaries, though. I mean, this is some work from the Stockholm Institute about planetary boundaries. Some of you will have seen this before. And you can see that nitrogen's one of the big one that's blown out. Genetic diversity, phosphorus, climate change, land use system change. The black dots on this graph is another paper, and I've got the citation there. Black dots show you how much the animals have influenced those blowouts of boundaries. So we should be inside the green circle, and we're right out there, and it's mostly because of animal agriculture. And I'm sure that most of you will have seen graphs a bit like this, but this is just showing, this is greenhouse gases. So thinking about climate change now. So they've got those graphs starting from the bottom, it's per gram of protein, per serving, and per kilocalorie of energy. And you can see those different diets there, and you can see the different, starting with the worst on the right with ruminant red meat, and then working your way across to the left. See, the blue bars are fish and fishing, and that's really surprisingly high levels. of greenhouse gas emissions associated with that. And that's really just because the fishermen have to go further and further and further and bigger boats with bigger and bigger engines to chase smaller and smaller fish and further down the food chain as we fish out the fisheries. And that's why those bars are big, and they'll be getting bigger. And then you just work your way across to the left, dairy and eggs, and then across to cereals at the lowest end there of greenhouse gas emissions. So really clear picture here about how what you eat makes such a big difference to greenhouse gases too. And it doesn't end there. More than half of the sedimentation of waterways is through accelerated erosion from livestock. 37% of pesticide use, half of all the antibiotic use on the planet, 64% of ammonia loss to ecosystems, and 33% of all of the anthropogenic nitrogen and phosphorus to fresh water comes from animal agriculture. Okay, and the dietary differences are really big, and you've got to think about processing and transporting and packaging as well. So this graph here shows it really nicely. I think there's red meat on the left with the biggest eutrophication potential. That's the amount of nitrogen or fertilizer that will go and eutrophy ecosystems. You can see the big blue bar there, and there's a big range as well. I mean, those it depends on where you are in the world and how you do it. But agriculture definitely the highest part of that red meat, and then you've got the processing, transporting, and packaging, which is really tiny for red meat. But then you get to dairy, and the agriculture part of it's not that high, but a huge bar for processing. And for example, in New Zealand, where we use coal, fossil fuels is the worst of the lot, coal to dry the water out of our milk, then that's why that's such a big red bar there. And then you can see across, and cereals and carbs right up the bottom, barely see them on the chart. Okay, so when it comes to land, then livestock is the biggie. 70% of all agricultural land, and about a third of all of the land on the planet is used by animal agriculture. And a whole chunk of that is used for feed and forage for them, not necessarily exactly where they're running around, but growing food for them for feedlots. In the tropics, 83% of the expansion was the clearance of forests, and livestock were a major contributor to that. And just to give you an idea, I mean, these numbers you can find different studies, but a vegetarian diet on average uses 1/8 of the area that needed for an omnivorous diet. And so here's a study. This is from the States, from the USA only, but just going across from that, the sort of average diet of an American on the left there, and you've got cultivated land, cropland, and grazing land, and you can see as you work your way across to a vegetarian diet, how much less land is involved, and really clear that that's the way you need to go for land use. And then land use per gram of protein, if you look at it that way, then you can see for beef and mutton, you need a square meter of land to get the same amount of protein that something like pulses would only need 1/100th of a meter to get the same amount of protein from that. So really clearly a very inefficient way of producing food is to have animals involved in it. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of threats coming out of this current animal-dominated food production model. So it's not a choice thing. There's no other way out of this. The nitrogen bomb, which is the fact that so much nitrogen from greenhouse gases from fossil fuels is used in the food system. Got greenhouse gas emissions, nitrous oxide and methane, as well as carbon dioxide. Peak phosphorus, so the other nutrient that we need, we've mined all over the world and now we've almost run out of it. Antibiotic resistance, which is a huge threat to all of us health-wise, and half of it being used for animal agriculture. Really big issues arising around animal health and welfare. We had a couple of people at the talk on Monday morning from SAFE. There's a lot of concern about animals and having to slaughter them for food and the way that they're treated. Big issues for human health. A lot of the pathogens that are found in cows are very dangerous for humans, and we're getting antibiotic-resistant bacteria turning up in cattle systems now, and our rivers in Canterbury as well. We got the freshwater pollution that I showed the pictures of, and the oceans as well with those dead zones. just that dominance of animals in the human animal food system that I talked about, the 98.2%. And that just the social license of animal agriculture is being lost as well, with so many headlines coming out now showing that animal and agriculture has such a big impact. The thing is that there's a lot of sort of solutions that are talked about. So one of them is precision agriculture. You know, these are just tinkering things that it's just less harmful to do it this way. But these are the sort of solutions that the industry comes up with. But really, what we need to do is stop using synthetic nitrogen and fossil fuels in our food production systems. And the only way we're going to do that is with way less animals. There'll always be parts of the world that will have to have animals, but well, I mean that you can't grow food directly for humans, and you would need to have animals on it, but nowhere near at the rate that it is at the moment. I'm working with Landcorp, which is New Zealand's biggest farmer. Their brand name's Pamu now. Been on an environmental reference group for 3 years with them, and we've changed things. So PKE is palm kernel expeller. So New Zealand is the biggest user of palm kernel byproduct, I guess, from the palm kernel, the palm oil processing to feed our cows. But the Landcorp has stopped using that and show that farming can be profitable without it. They're working their way towards carbon neutrality, and we're working on trying to get them to not use artificial nitrogen anymore. And we need to compare these systems around energy use as well. But just to give you a little example of plant-based versus animal-based. So there's big issues in Southland with very, very wet soils in wintertime, and cows getting bogged in wet paddocks and being fed root crops and just sort of almost drowning in mud down there. It was an area that up until very recently was well known as a cropping area for oats and wheat. And this is a really simple little calculation that some of the experts at Landcorp did. If we were to cut out the cow and just make the milk out of plants, in this case wheat, and have wheat milk instead of cow's milk, to give you an idea that, so about 4 times more gross energy per hectare without the cows in there could be produced, nearly twice as much protein per hectare with no cows, 14 times less greenhouse gas emissions per tonne of product. And if you're talking about irrigated land, then it's 40 times less water needed if you don't have the cows there. So really good example here of a much better solution. And this was potentially a project that was going to happen in Southland. But the other key thing that you need when you're thinking about how you're going to make milk out of plants is you need good clean water to do that. And when the bores and the groundwater were looked at around this area where there would potentially be a factory to produce this stuff, then it's already at 4 or 5, in some cases 6 times the maximum allowable value for nitrogen in fresh water. So we'd already, if you think about it, we've kind of closed the gate on an option for the future by what we're doing now is cut off our chances of being able to do the right thing in the future. So it's a really big worry. Okay, so what we need to do is we have to change, we have to have a paradigm shift in the way we use the planet and what we eat and what we do. One of the solutions that's doing the rounds at the moment, it's really popular, is Kate Raworth, a British economist, who's talked about this thing called the donut. And that comes back to that picture that I showed earlier on about the planetary boundaries that have been overstepped. And so she talks about the donut being within the 2 dark green rings there. You can't go inside because the shortfall on the inside would mean that there were a whole lot of social foundations that would be lost. But also you can't go outside of it because the planet can't handle it. So you have to fit inside that circle, and this is kind of a model for how we have to live in the future. And the way that we're going to do that, the only way we're going to do that, is we have to break our addiction to nitrogen and fossil fuel for 2 reasons, for climate change reasons, but also because we're not going to have it available. So we have to get out, we have to just kind of go cold turkey and get ourselves off that addiction as quickly as possible. We've only got a few years now to do it. Regenerative or closed loop or biological farming, there's so many terms for it. But what it means is that you have farming systems that don't allow nutrients to be lost from the system. You retain them within the system, and pretty much that means not having animals. But if you do have them, then you don't let any of the waste go out to you. It has to go back. Nature is made up of cycles. You have to cycle it back again. And to do that, we have to start using true cost analyses. At the moment, we are subsidizing, we're not just subsidizing fossil fuels, we're also subsidizing really unsustainable farming practices. And we're subsidizing it in New Zealand by allowing farmers to leave their externalities for the rest of society to pay, or the farming industry. The farmers are just caught up in this whole process. But so we have to account using true cost. So that means that the costs of cleaning up must be put back onto farmers. And when it comes to changing our diets, we have to get animals out of it. I mean, another way you could think of it, it's not, you don't have to, it doesn't have to be a choice. It's animals or us. It's them or us. And you can see that when it's 98%, 2%, then we've almost got to that us versus them thing. And the only way we're going to do this is to stop our obsession with growth. This whole economic and this capitalist system that we have that is dependent on growth can't happen. We have to manage our way down, or we're just going to have a really nasty crash. I think it's, you could shut your eyes and carry on and wait for what happens, or we could manage our way down. I think that's like be much easier if we manage our way out of this. And we've got to face the facts and talk about these things, get it out, talk about it. And of course, the way we do that is to not be taken in by the weapons of mass distraction like the Kardashians and sport. Okay, so that's pretty much. There's a chapter that if anyone wants to email me, or maybe I can give this to Hannah to put online. There's a chapter called Our Deadly Nitrogen Addiction that was in that book, the New Zealand Land and Food Animal, our annual, and so I can give you a copy of that. That's sort of got all of the references and all the details that I showed in this talk. There's the book Polluted Inheritance. It's just gone through a reprint because it's still selling well. And there's a follow-up to that book called Mountains to the Sea, where I've edited a book with a whole bunch of authors from farming and environmental areas that go into much more detail. But I guess my final word is that activism is our rent for living on this planet. Alice Walker said that, but that's the message for all of us now, that we've got to the point now where doing nothing will not get us there. We all have to be much more vocal and much more active to try and make sure we change the way that we live, and so that we have opportunities for our children to have a world to live in. It's that serious. We change or we won't have that option.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Mike. Riveting as always. And I just really like how honest you are about this, because at a time like this, we definitely need to know this information and get that out there. So you mentioned, this whole thing is sad, and I agree. A lot of us do feel really sad about this, can be quite emotional, but we do only have a few years to fix this. So we're not going to spend too long kind of drowning ourselves in our sorrows. And I think we do want to learn more and focus on action. Heading over onto the questions. The first one is from Hiker. So he's saying, we've got tens of thousands of scientists agreeing that this is an urgent emergency. So how much more noise do scientists need to make for the politicians to take notice, or does it need to be the public as well as scientists?
I think scientists can only kind of warn the public. I think the public, the politicians, and this is so much clearer to me now after being involved in this policy area and working with Ministry for the Environment and spending some time with Chloe Swarbrick from the Greens, who has made it so plain to me that the only way that governments will change is when we make them change. They have to have the people pushing them. They will not do the tough things because they'll get voted out. They've got to do, if they do tough things, they've got to have the people behind them. So we have to make it happen. It's not going to happen. They're not going to, we don't have leaders, that will lead, because if they lead and most of the population don't know there's a problem, then they're gone by lunchtime. So we have to make them change.
Great. And Lee's asking, how do we get this message to people who show interest in switching to a more plant-based diet, or they don't care about the environmental impact of agriculture?
Well,
What's your
I think
thoughts
it's
on that?
not that. Well, I don't think that people don't care. They just don't know. If they did
Mm,
know, they would care. There's no way no one. I just don't believe that people could intentionally destroy the environment for their future if they knew that. People only do it because they're not aware. So many conversations that I get in with farmers where they believe that because they farm to within the limits that are set by regional councils and government, that therefore it must be doing no harm.
mm,
It's just patently not true. And so, that's it's getting that message across there that's really, really hard.
yes. It's partly what I'm trying to work on is building that awareness around, how
Mm,
much power we really do have on
yeah,
our plates and our choices.
yeah.
So in that thread, Carol asked, are plant-based milks less environmentally dangerous even with their packaging? So you had a nice slide comparing regular cow milk versus plant milk.
Well,
So
they're
what
both going to
about
have
the
their
packaging?
packaging. So yeah, they're both going to have their packaging, and we've got issues with packaging. But I think it's a really good point, maybe that she was touching on there, that you can do any kind of agriculture badly. You can do horticulture badly. Um, there's plenty of examples from around New Zealand of horticulture that is just as harmful, if not more harmful, than animal agriculture, including dairy. So um, just switching, and it's to me, it's as simple as monocultures. If it's a whatever it is, if it's being grown in a monoculture, then you can almost guarantee that will be having harmful effects. Because when you grow a monoculture like that, you then get attacked by all the pests, and you have to control so many things that then it becomes a really industrial form of farming. So
Mm,
I think that we have to be really, really careful, because at the moment we have a lot of plant-based alternatives here. We don't know the provenance of the plants that are being used in those processes, because they're not being grown here, they're being grown somewhere else. And
mm,
so, yep, I think we have to be really, really cognizant of the fact that switching from one system to another doesn't make it okay if you don't make sure that you do that in a sustainable way as well. You switch to, obviously, for a whole bunch of reasons, animals have to go, but we also have to be careful that we don't just turn into a plant-based uh, planet destroying process as well. So it's very, very, very tricky.
yeah, absolutely. Someone else has also said look into Extinction Rebellion. So that's a group that's raising a lot of noise about this around the
Mm.
world and having a lot of impact, and they're in a lot of
Yeah,
cities around New Zealand.
yep.
So a good one to tap into. Also on the milk point, you
Mm.
can make your own milk at home if you're wanting to do that, say from oats. So you can soak oats, blend them up with water, strain it, and then you've got some oat milk. Or we don't really need to have any sort of milk, even plant milk, in our diets. So we can just be looking for recipes that don't require that sort of thing. So then we avoid the packaging as well. Okay, so um, we had a question from Anna asking about whether Landcorp's looking to convert any farms from animals to more plant-based products.
Yes,
Have
yes, that's a big, big part of the job. So already 10% of the dairy farms are now are organic, but there's a, a, a whole lot of plans to um, just sort of investigate every possible alternative to animals, because there are definitely parts of New Zealand, and Canterbury would be included, where to meet environmental and safe human health limits, then animals just aren't part of the picture.
mm,
So they're pushing as hard as they can, but they are also restricted by the fact that they're owned by the government. And our state-owned enterprises minister is Shane Jones, and Shane is not a fan of. He's a fan of money, and he wants the uh, New Zealand's government farmer, to be bringing money in, and they don't want to think about change. So where you've got this system where we kind of subsidize doing bad stuff, then it's very, very hard to switch to the good things because there's
Mm.
so much debt and money and land value tied up in the right to pollute. So definitely there's, yeah, if the environment group have their way, then there'll be a lot less animals on land court farms.
Yeah, great. Um, Someone's commented saying they want to give this video of the webinar to everybody in New Zealand for Christmas. So maybe we
Yeah,
can
that sounds
maybe we
good.
can we can all send it to Shane as well.
Yeah, yeah, good idea.
Um, Great. So someone was asking a question around the fertilizers, how they're
Yeah.
polluting, and whether natural nitrogen fertilizers have the same or similar impact as the synthetic
Well,
ones.
you don't need a nitrogen fertilizer. We have legumes, we have clovers that fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. You don't have to add anything. What we did right up until 1980 in New Zealand was that all of the nitrogen that was a part of the whole dairy process came from white clover. Our paddocks
Hmm.
were full of clover. You can fix nitrogen naturally. But just think about it. If something is natural like that, then there's no profit in it. People can't sell something. So it's this weird system that we work under where we could do it and get it for nothing, but somebody makes a business out of it and turns gas into fertilizer, and then you have trucks and factories and workers, and then you can have a company and you can make money out of it. So then we do that.
Yeah,
It's really bizarre when you think about it.
doesn't make sense, does it?
No.
So in your view,
Mhm.
do you think that the current world population can be fed through permaculture and organic principles?
Yes, as long as there are no animals in there. I think it's going to be a struggle, and we won't be able to have the lifestyles that we do, and we won't be able to have, any day of the year shops full of, oranges and whatever out of season things. But yeah, if we get animals out of the system, then there is a much more potential to feed the current population. If we leave animals in there, they're so inefficient in the process that then we'll have real big trouble without fossil fuels.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, so Craig's asking, how do we incentivize industry to revert to growing fruit and veggies again? So,
Well,
what do you
look, I
think?
don't know that I don't think you can incentivize it because we don't
Mm,
have. If you wanted to feed New Zealanders, then half a dozen farms could do that of the size of farm we have now. Then what are the rest of them going to do? Because at the moment we make this white powder commodity that we sell for next to nothing overseas, and we are the biggest exporter of dairy of any country in the world. That's how we have the money turnover happening around that, and most of it goes to as a food additive or to replace breast milk in the form of infant formula. So it doesn't feed the world; it just replaces another natural thing and with an unnatural one. So it's very so you've got a system that's so biased towards bad outcomes and sort of subsidizing bad outcomes. To try and fix that with a market model, it won't work
mm,
because the true costs, until you start charging the true costs of it, then you can't incentivize it.
mm. So, if most of our milk is being exported in the form of powder,
Mhm.
Kate's asking, how can New Zealand's changing their diet have an impact on the dairy practices?
It won't. It won't. And so only 2% of what Fonterra sells is to New Zealand customers. So you could just take milk out of every supermarket and every shop in New Zealand, and they would probably just shrug their shoulders and wouldn't care less because it's such a tiny part of what they do.
So, what would be the message in terms of trying to influence reducing the number of animals in New Zealand if it's not us changing our behaviours? Are you kind of encouraging us to be more vocal about that as well? And
Yeah, yeah, no, that's for
yeah,
sure. I mean, we have to demand
mm,
drinkable water in Canterbury for a start. I mean, what you've had is just one industry that's destroyed that right, that thing that we all believe that we should have, which is water that comes out of the tap, which is drinkable. And
mm,
and so our lives are put at danger because of what's happened there. So we have to we have to say, no, that's not acceptable. I mean, there are other land uses that there are, there is hemp. Um, there's so many things that we could be doing instead. Fiber that we could grow,
Mm,
flaxes and
mm,
all kinds of plants that we can use for more than just food. We can use for so many other uses as well.
yeah.
There's honey, there's trees, we could build all of our buildings and houses out of trees because we won't be able to use concrete in the future. If concrete was a country, it would be the third biggest greenhouse gas emitter on the planet. So, we've got such an advantage here to be able to use. We're just going to have to kind of become a much more insular economy, but the whole world will be doing that as well. So, the land
Hmm.
should be not just for food, but for housing and for keeping us warm and clothing us and all that kind of thing as well.
Yeah, great. I like what you're touching on there about water and its cleanliness or not so much. And it
Mm,
reminded me of a video I watched last week by Brad Dixon, who I think is in our audience here. He is a physiotherapist and he has a business called Everfit. And he gave a presentation about expansive wellness. And he talked about, this focus that we have on micronutrients, where we're not really paying much attention to macronutrients or mega nutrients like air and water, and we're breathing in, thousands of liters of air and drinking several liters of water a day. So we should be, demanding that our air and our water
mm.
are the best that we can get. So I'd
Yeah,
encourage
no, for
anyone
sure.
to
Yeah.
to have a look at Brad's video. Maybe he'll put the link in there if he's still on. Okay, so Olivia asked a question around what is the biggest knowledge gap stopping us from changing our food systems, both here in New Zealand and globally?
Yeah, I'm not sure that yeah, okay. So there's a knowledge gap probably with the general public. There's not a knowledge gap among scientists about what the issues are. There's just this sort of overpowering market growth model that means that it doesn't, that people will just turn a blind eye to how destructive something is. There's a lot of this kind of, well, if we don't do it, someone else will do it talk, or
Mm,
our greenhouse gas emissions are so tiny, why should we do it? There's all these excuses that are around why we shouldn't do stuff. And as long as everybody uses that excuse, then we'll just march on into oblivion. So we have to stop playing those kind of games.
yeah, there were a fefew questions coming up around, if we don't have the cows, someone else will.
Yeah,
And
yeah. Well, yeah, it's like, of course you could say that. Like, if I didn't smash into you, someone else would have smashed into you. So it's all right. Like it doesn't make it okay. It's no excuse. It's like we have to change, and we all have to change. There's no place to go to. We haven't got another Earth. We can't go to Mars.
yeah,
We have to do it. Yeah.
and often we find, well, speaking around moving towards plant-based diet, that it's not as hard or as horrible as we
Yeah.
initially thought.
Oh,
So
exactly. Yeah,
I
yeah.
think a lot of these other changes, if we're
Yeah.
talking about degrowth and things, our lives become more simplistic. But perhaps, we won't miss these things that we've been used to, and we might end up in a
Yeah.
happier, healthier place. Well, that's
Oh,
that's
for
a
sure.
prediction.
I can see where we will end up, and it's
Mm,
such a nice place, and the country's like a big permaculture farm, and
mm,
being on the land and growing on the land and being part of the land is just, and communities are restored, and it's
mm,
really cool. It's how we get there's the tricky bit, and
yeah.
it's important we don't lose sight of the fact that. Uh, where we need to be is so much nicer than where we are now, but it's
Mm,
just so easy to kind of make it look like it's the end of the world when it's not. Because yeah, like you say, I gave up smoking, I've given up a number of things, and you think it's going to be the end of the world, and it isn't. It's better, and so yeah, it's
yeah.
just that making that change. Eh?
Yeah. I'll just add in my little 2 cents here about how we can help the shift. I think cooking for people is one way that we can, just spread that, because people have this perception that plant-based food is, disgusting and it won't fill us up. So proving them wrong, I've found, is always very helpful. Someone was saying, the big elephant in the room is overpopulation.
Hmm.
So, have you got any comments on
Yeah,
that?
well, I think that's kind of a false elephant because um, it's not about numbers, it's about consumption. And so most of the increase of people on the planet, well, just pick your countries, I don't know, Bangladesh or 12 Bangladeshis, one of us would use more water, more food, more everything, more greenhouse gases than a dozen or more, people living in India or some other part of the world. So, 50% of the damage done to the planet is done by the richest 10% on the planet, which is us. And so I think it's kind of, I mean, of course it's true that population is the problem, but it's that population times consumption thing. So it's not equal among people. And if we
Mm,
if we all lived lifestyles like, much closer to the average Indian people on the Indian continent, then the numbers aren't such a big issue at all. It's what we consume. That's the deal.
yeah. Okay. So, a question around one of the graphs that you put up, which was around
Yeah,
the land use per gram of protein,
yeah.
and it showed that beef or red meat had by far the highest, going down towards plant products. What
Mm.
what sort of farming was that based on? So, do you
Oh,
know if that was
these are
around grass or grain feeding or?
no, well, it's a global average, so
Okay.
it's right across the whole thing. I mean, there's plenty of examples of, and there's good, good animal farming and really bad animal farming. And it's just a global average because, you know, it, at that level, that low intensity level, can be really good for soils and really good for the land and doesn't have big greenhouse gas emissions and things, but it still needs a huge area of land. It's a luxury that we might have been able to
Mm,
have if there were a billion people on the planet, but it's not a luxury we can have with 9 billion, or what are we going to end up with?
yeah, sure. Okay, so Brad is asking, shouldn't we be valuing our clean waterways as part of our tourism industry? So have you
Yeah,
looked much
yeah.
into the cost of, what we might lose if our tourism industry suffers as a result of our pollution?
Well, I think that probably the biggest loser from our pollution will be the agricultural industry.
Mm,
The biggest value add that we have is our clean green image. So the pers the industry, or the group of people that are going to be most harmed by harming our environment, is the farming industry. And so I call it an own goal. They just kicked an own goal. They're just
yeah.
shooting down their own ability to be able to farm in the future and to be able to make
Mm,
money in the future. I mean, if they just
yeah.
want to be commodity suppliers of the cheapest possible white powder, then carry on doing what you're doing. And it's just a competition between the rest of the world to see who can produce the cheapest milk powder. And the winner of that little competition is the one with the worst agricultural protection, the worst labor protection. It's a race to the bottom, and we're winning that race at the moment. So, it's not a race that you want to win. It's a very short-sighted, take your money and
Mm,
run, kind of option.
yeah.
So, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
no, I don't think it does. And of course, tourism is actually a bigger earner than dairy, and so many more tourists are now aware of the state of our waterways. You see these articles coming up in the China Daily and the New York Times and all of these things about just how bad our environment is. And I don't know how much longer we get to keep that clean green image. We must be really doing some damage to it now.
Yeah. Agreed. And you talk about, winning the races and these things that we don't want to win. And in health, it's similar. So Dr. Mark Craig, who's on, he is saying we're first in the world for bowel cancer. We're third in the world for adult obesity and also third for childhood obesity. So there's a lot of
Mm,
these stats, which, we don't want to be doing that well in, and a lot of it
no.
is really strongly linked to the foods that we're either farming
Yeah,
or
well,
we're eating.
the water as well. I mean, I forgot to
Mm,
mention when I was talking about that, the water nitrates in water that are associated with colorectal cancer. That the highest rates of colorectal cancer in New Zealand are in Canterbury. We're highest
Yeah.
in the world in New Zealand, highest in New Zealand and Canterbury. Could be just a coincidence, but it's hard to imagine.
More research there, perhaps.
Mm.
Um, so Anna has asked if we've considered talking to the Ministry of Education to encourage them to incorporate whole food plant-based recipes into cooking technology and other classes. I haven't yet. However, I have recently joined the advisory group for a wonderful charity called Doctors for Nutrition. And one of the things that they're trying to do is to be influencing, um, the health organizations, the government, the charities, and also, building awareness in the public. So, Doctors for Nutrition is a great group to support if you would like to see more happening there. So yeah, we have a huge list of things that we want to do, and we've got a lot of people who are keen to do it. So the more support we can drum up for that, I think the faster that we can try and see these things happening. And I've got another slide on Doctors for Nutrition coming up. Healthy vegan food in hospitals. So Julie's talking about that. I'm really excited to be based in Nelson, where we have quite a number of clinicians and researchers working on plant-based food, and that was reflected when we showed the Big Fat Lie in Nelson. If you haven't watched that documentary, highly recommend it. It's a New Zealand film. And we had 2 sold-out screenings. About 300 people came along, and we had a great panel with these local doctors and a public health professor called John Potter, who's authored a BWB title like the one that Mike put up, and his one's called Thought for Food, so that's worth a read as well. So one of those people in Nelson is Rob Beaglehole, and he got sugary drinks banned from hospitals in Nelson and Marlborough, and they were the first in the world. And now he's looking at how can we make it even healthier, and looking at, what might the next question be. And I think that, processed meats or getting whole food plant-based options on there would be a good candidate for that. So hopefully we'll be seeing a lot of movement happening and seeing that spread across New Zealand. I am conscious that we're, running over time, so I'm going to wrap up that discussion there. We've got lots of questions that we didn't get answered, but Mike is quite active on his Facebook page, so I guess if you've got any burning questions, perhaps put them out to him there. And he does a lot of talks around the place, so watch out for those, and maybe you'll get to attend another one. Mike, have you got any final comments before I go to our last slides for upcoming information?
No, but if I give you that PDF of that chapter, will you be able to make that available?
Yeah, we'll make
Yeah,
that
cool.
happen.
So, yeah, cool. Okay, that's great. No, that's all good. Thank you.
Great. Well, big thank you again, Mike, for coming on and sharing all that with us. I think what you're doing is absolutely amazing, um, and we can't wait to see what else you share next. And
Okay,
hopefully
thank
you
you.
might come on to a future webinar and not make it your one and only.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. I hope it'll be a beginning.
So speaking of which, next webinar coming up, we've got Ben Eichelberg. So it's going to be about fitness, how we can reach peak performance eating plant-based. If you would like to see these webinars continuing, so Ben's the next one that we've got locked in, but this was really a bit of a pilot. So we want to make sure that it's viable, and that we can, maintain this service and allow more than 100 people to be logging in. So I have set up recently Patreon. So this allows people to become a member from just $1 a month. So trying to make it quite affordable. You'll get access to a members only feed, and really just adds up to be able to cover these costs and allow us to spread these to reach more people. So the link is there if you would like to have a look more. We've also got some recipes that you can tap into. So if you go to the Better Base website, then you can get the free week of the ridiculously good recipes, and that's the first of a 12-week program, which is $36 if you wanted to tap into the 12 weeks and learn how to cook this way. So then we've got the next event coming up is the Dine with a Doc. So this is part of the Doctors for Nutrition initiative, and this is on a Friday morning before we start a big weekend-long conference looking at lifestyle medicine. So we're going to have a panel Q&A session going to have breakfast at the Little Bird Cafe, and you can come along and meet a few more of the people who are involved with that charity, and yeah, ask us any more questions that you've got about the health side of things, because eating more plant-based foods is not just great to slash our environmental footprint, but it's also one of the best things that we can do for our health, reducing our risk of many different diseases. And also, if we have got some of these diseases, then helping us to manage them. And in some cases, we can reverse them as well. So someone's asked to put the link to the Patreon there. Oh, Bex has just done that, so that's great. Thank you, Bex. So up until the next webinar and the Dime with the Doc event, if you would like to keep up with what we're doing, we've got the Facebook page, we've got an Instagram page, and I also try and keep the website updated. And you can also find those other webinars there. So there's one from Dr. Luke Wilson, one from dietitian Emma Strutt, and also the one from MasterChef winner Aaron Brunet. So hopefully we're covering off a lot of the bases now about questions that people might have when they start looking at whether to follow a plant-based diet or not. So feel free to share that link with any of your friends and colleagues who might be interested in eating more plants. So that brings us to a close. Again, just thank you so much for tapping on. Hopefully we will have upgraded our service for next time to allow many more people to come and join us. So yeah, look forward to seeing you then. Have a great night.